Kim Peets and welcome to My Story, His Story. What do we know about Seventh-day Adventist church leaders and how has God influenced them? In this series we take a closer look at these Christian leaders and invite them to share some of their stories with us. Here with me is Pastor Geoff Youlden, public evangelist. Hi Geoff.
Hi Kim, nice to be here with you.
It's lovely to have you with us.
Thank you.
You're the first person that I ever saw as an Adventist in my home television in the lounge room. And I have to say I'm a little bit overwhelmed to be talking with you today.
Oh, it's very nice to be with you, Kim. Actually, it's a great privilege to meet so many folk who have been influenced over the years. I guess that's the reward of a minister, and particularly an evangelist. I mean, there are lots of stressful things, there are lots of difficulties, and there's lots of down points in ministry, but the high point is just what you've said. You know, when you're meeting folk continually who say, today I know Jesus, I know his message, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist because you ran some meetings here or there or hither or yon, and that's a very great rewarding experience.
Oh, fantastic. So why so committed to public evangelism?
That's a good question, Kim. That's a very, very good question. I am very committed to it. I've done it for nearly 40 years now. And the reason I've done it is because continually I see the results like you've just been talking about. I mean, what other work could you do in the Adventist ministry and see such lasting rewards? So I'm committed to it from that point of view, but I'm also committed to it because it is the biblical method. You see, if you go back to the story of Paul, and I just want to read you what Paul's philosophy of evangelism, and I've always thought that Paul could teach us a few things, seeing that he raised up so many different churches, you know, throughout all Asia there. And in Acts 20 and verse 20, which I call 2020 vision, you know, it's better vision than I've got now. But Acts 20:20 says this. Talking of Paul's methodology of evangelism, it says, "How I kept back nothing that was helpful, but proclaimed it to you and taught you publicly," that's public evangelism, "and from house to house." So you see, public evangelism is the biblical model. And the reason I'm committed to it is primarily because that's the biblical method. And by the way, also the church has always been strong when public evangelism has been its strongest.
Okay.
If you look back through the history of the Christian church, even before the Adventist church came along, public evangelism was a very big part of the Methodist movement, the Reformation, and also the Adventist. Wherever the Adventist church is strong in soul winning, public evangelism is the major part of its outreach. Now it's interesting, isn't it, that in our countries, in the Western world, in the last 15 to 20 years, we have seen some who have come along suggesting that it's outdated, you know, it's not so relevant today and so forth. And what has happened? It's interesting that we've had a decline in accessions to the truth. But my experience is that wherever a church is on fire and wants to reap their interest, and after all, public evangelism is greatest when it is reaping. That is, we've already stirred up the interest through lots of sowing campaigns. You know, we've run this and that, cooking classes and door-to-door work and stirred up the interest. Then we need to bring those folk through to a decision, and that's where public evangelism excels. And it's interesting, I mean, where else can you go? I've just been to a church just last week, and there, after 2 weeks, we had about 15 new people sitting in the church on Sabbath morning. Now, you tell me, Kim, what else could we do to have folk, new people I'm talking about, in the church on Sabbath within 2 weeks of starting?
That's fantastic.
I think that's, I mean, why would you want to do anything else? I can't imagine how a minister in the Adventist church would not want to do public evangelism. It's the most wonderful and the most soul-stirring, and the church folk love it, they're supportive, and it's biblical. So that's the reason why I'm committed to public evangelism. If someone can show me something that's better, then I'm going to be the first person to put my hand up to accept it. But nobody's been able to show, because I don't believe there is, because it's biblical.
Okay. Isn't it tiring work? How does it go?
Well, it is. And I guess it's not only tiring, Kim, it's also stressful. And I mean, the truth is that on any any day that you start a public program, your next meeting tells everybody everything, doesn't it? I mean, if there's no audience, it's a pretty stressful situation,
yes,
isn't it?
Yes, yes.
And I guess that this is the reason why many guys never take it up, because of the stress that's involved. And I mean, you're standing there naked.
Yeah, okay.
Aren't you? I mean, everybody can see whether there's an audience or not. You can't, there's nowhere to hide. So I guess that many folk just feel that that's too tough. And so they choose to do other things. But those other things, unfortunately, are not nearly as successful.
Do you have to move around a lot? Like, how does it work? How have you done it?
Well, in the work that I do these days, I have to travel far too much, but I'm not sure how to get around that. I've often thought about this.
Yes.
You know, I just wish that I didn't have to be away for sometimes 2 or 3 weeks at a time. I mean, that's tough on the wife and the family and so forth. Very, very tough. But I haven't always done it that way. I've been involved with public evangelism in the churches, in the cities that I've lived in, and that's not quite as bad, but these days it involves a lot of travel.
And how does your family go with that?
Well, if I didn't have a very supportive wife, I would never be able to do that, and I guess that's another criteria for being a successful evangelist. You've got to have a wife who is very, very committed to it. And while she would be lonely like any girl on her own, night after night, nevertheless she's very committed to it because she believes in what I'm doing. And so the support is a very, very important part.
Oh, that's
And I'm very
fantastic.
grateful for Lynn, who has never ever flinched or never tried to discourage me, but rather encouraged me all the way along. So that's wonderful.
Oh, that's great. Stay tuned. We'll have more after this break. Welcome back to My Story, His Story. I've been talking with Pastor Geoff Youlden. Thanks, Geoff. I've really enjoyed listening to some of your stories about being a public evangelist. It sounds amazing, and it is just a very, very interesting life that you've led. Tell us more. You've gone from public evangelism, from town to town, to television. Tell us more about that.
Yes, well, Kim, many years ago, about 20 odd years ago, we had the opportunity, the church asked me whether we would get involved with television. Now, that was a scary experience because I'd never done anything like that before. And I tell you, it's a totally different skill, as I was soon to find out. Because what has happened, you sort of train yourself on the public platform, you know, to be giving out and to be preaching to often thousands of people, and that's one type of skill. But then when television came along, of course, it's a sort of a one-to-one, you know, just very intimate.
Yes.
And it was very hard to scale back the public presentation back to the one-to-one.
Before the break, you mentioned that that it's very, you're up there, and if there's not crowds of people listening, you know, it's quite a vulnerable feeling, but it's not like that on television, is it?
No, and of course you haven't got an audience, and therefore the energy and so forth that has to be generated has to be generated in your own mind.
That must be very hard.
Which is a different skill, yes. But I look back upon the years that we did some training and so forth, and wonderfully good years, and I'm just so grateful I've had the opportunity of doing these things, because I guess that very few people ever have those opportunities, and I've been fortunate.
And Focus on Living was your first TV presentation,
yes,
wasn't it?
Focus on Living was the first time that Australia and New Zealand had ever produced a television program, because we've always imported it from America, but then we produced our own. So Focus on Living was groundbreaking, so to speak.
Yes, amazing. And then later on you've had the Search series, which has been highly successful.
Yes, well, the Search series has been the most successful thing that we've ever done, I think, as a church as a whole, when it comes to the public, because the success of the Search has been the fact that so many people have been influenced. And I mean, who would have thought, and I certainly didn't believe this or think it even when we were conceiving the idea, that advertising the reasons Christ is coming soon would attract the public.
Yeah.
But the amazing thing is, that subject is what rings all the bells. As soon as they advertise, the telephones burn down.
That's amazing.
And it's an amazing thing in this secular country.
That is just amazing.
So it's been very, very successful.
And I'm sure there'll be much more to come. Now tell us about your first campaign. I'm sure that would have been a very nerve-wracking experience for you.
Well, it was, but Kim, it was something I always wanted to do. And so it was in Wodonga in Victoria, you know, Albury, Wodonga on the border there between New South Wales and Victoria. And Wodonga in those days wasn't quite the same as it is today. And there was a little hall where there's a big Woolworths today, because every time I drive down from Sydney to Melbourne, I pass by the very spot that little hall was. It's gone. But my first campaign was run in that hall. I can still remember it, standing on the big stage and looking at the audience down below. And you know, that year I baptised 23 people in Albury Church. So, you know, that really fired me. Yeah, greatly fired me. And it showed to me that even though I was young and wet behind the ears and all the other things that you are when you're first starting off, I felt that that conviction that I had felt in my heart through all my Avondale days and even before that was now starting to come to fruition. And so I was off. And after the Albury experience, then I went to Tumut, you know, in the Snowy Mountains, at the bottom of the Snowy Mountains.
Yes.
And cold old Tumut. And Batlow, where they grow the apples. And so from then on, we went out to South New South Wales, because I was in the South New South Wales Conference. That is the southern part of New South Wales. And it was a country conference. Yes. Country and all little churches and little towns. So I haven't always stood before big audiences. Sometimes I've stood before very, very small audiences. Let me tell you something, Kim. When I got into the bigger campaigns, I sometimes would dream at night about what was going to happen the next day. You know, when you've got thousands of dollars on your head and you've got folk working with you and great expectations and so forth.
It's nerve-wracking.
It is. And I would sort of not purposely stress at night, but you sort of wake up and you dream. And sometimes I used to dream that I was standing on the public platform in my pyjamas. Imagine how embarrassing that would be. And then sometimes I would actually lose the skin on my hands through stress. Now these days I don't lose the skin on my hands, and I don't often dream about standing in front of the audience with my pyjamas on, but nevertheless you can see the humanity of all this. It is a stressful experience, and I guess this is why a lot of fellows don't want to do it.
Oh, I can understand. I have to say, I think you've got the special gift, and God has definitely blessed you with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I enjoy what I'm doing. I don't have to drive myself every day. I enjoy it.
And that's great.
And I guess that's part of the success of anything, isn't it? If you enjoy doing it,
that's right.
It's a lot easier to do. And
how many evangelism programs do you think you've run?
Yeah, that's a good question, Kim. Well, in reflection, I guess that for the last 20 years I've been running about 8 campaigns per year on an average. So if you multiply that out, what's that when we went to school? 160 odd, isn't it? Your maths agree with that?
Well, yeah.
Somewhere in that vicinity. Yes, somewhere in that vicinity. Plus the fact that then on top of that I would have run many other campaigns, at least 40 before that. So if you add all that together, that's, say, approximately 200. And if you only had 10 baptisms per program, that would make over 2,000. And I think in many cases, of course, far more. I mean, in Adelaide, I remember we baptised 180 odd, and Perth 150. So, you know, the Lord is blessed with thousands of accessions to the faith. And as I said before, the most pleasing thing these days is when I travel around, there wouldn't be a place that I can go to that someone comes up to me and says, you know, my first contact was either through the search or through a campaign that you've run. And I'm meeting now kids whose parents, you know, came in. You know, my parents came in and so forth.
Like me.
Yeah. Makes me feel old, Kim. You know. But nevertheless, when I look back upon, we've had, what, 40-odd years in ministry. And the Lord's given me good health, and I enjoy the work, and I have no plans at this stage to stop.
Okay.
So, you know, as long as the Lord gives us strength and energy, we want to continue on doing the thing that's driven us all these years.
Fantastic. There'll be many more stories after this break. Welcome back to My Story, His Story. I've been talking with evangelist Pastor Geoff Youlden. Thank you, Geoff. It's been great chatting with you. I've really enjoyed hearing your stories of evangelism, public evangelism, and then the stories about the TV programs that you've been involved in, namely the Search series and Focus on Living. But your upbringing was a little bit different than perhaps what people might have imagined.
Yes, well, I wasn't born a Seventh-day Adventist. I was born up in the Presbyterian church.
Okay.
And, you know, someone came to our door selling Christian literature, Adventist books. And that was really the first introduction that we had to the Seventh-day Adventist. Never heard of them before.
True.
You know. And as a Presbyterian, we had no intention whatsoever of ever becoming a Seventh-day Adventist.
What was the turning point for your parents?
Well, the subject that was raised and discussed at that first meeting with that person who was selling books was the subject of what happens when a person dies. Because we believed, popularly, you know, go to heaven when you die. And she raised the issue. She said, do you know the Bible really doesn't teach that? And we said, what? You know, what? Doesn't teach? What do you mean? Everybody knows you go to heaven when you die. And actually it was a result of that discussion that gradually over a period of time, not 5 minutes, let me tell you, because Presbyterians don't change their minds easily. You know, they're very staunch, very, very tough people. And we weren't going to be pushed around. But gradually, the sweet reasonableness and the biblical strength of the argument was overwhelming. And finally, we became Seventh-day Adventists. My mother stepped out before my father did.
I can't even imagine how awful it must have been for you, and the thought of me losing my children would be heartbreaking as well. Back to talking about some of your inspiration and what led you to being an evangelist. Who was your inspiration?
Well, I guess that, you know, most of us have someone in our life that has been a great influence, and that's been certainly true in my life. The person who probably influenced me more than any other single person was George Burnside. Tremendous man, tremendous respect for the man, probably one of the greatest preachers that we've had in this country.
True.
And he, without a lot of education, was able to stand before thousands of people and very, very persuasively present the biblical story. So as a young teenager, I remember listening to him preach in Melbourne. He pitched a tent where the arts centre is now.
True.
That was a vacant area in those days. And he pitched this tent and I went along, and that made a very, very big impression upon me. And we then became friends, and I had the privilege of burying him when he died. And you know, I often think about him and the influence that he's had. Yeah. Wonderful man.
Fantastic. And what about your biblical inspiration? Who is your biblical inspiration?
Now, well, I have a story. You know, one of the greatest characters that I think that's in the Bible, and what I love about the Bible is that the Bible is not a sanitized book. You know, it records both the good and the bad about people. And that's good, because we all realise there's good and bad about us all, isn't there? And the story of Manasseh in the Old Testament, and it's recorded over here in 1 Kings. And I often think about this because this is really the prodigal son of the Old Testament. You know, we're very, very familiar about the story of the prodigal son of the New Testament. But this is the story of the prodigal son of the Old Testament. And the Bible says that he was so bad. This is 2 Kings 21 verse 9. It says here, look, listen to this, Kim. They paid no attention, and Manasseh seduced them, that's God's people, to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord had destroyed.
He was a pretty rotten character.
Terrible man. I mean, and the Amorites and the Moabites, God destroyed them. They were so filthy. And yet the Bible says that King Manasseh seduced God's people to do worse. And as you read the record here from the beginning of the 21st chapter, you find first of all that he was the son of Hezekiah. Now, if Hezekiah had done what God wanted him to do, Manasseh would never have been born. Because Manasseh, remember God said to Hezekiah, get your house in order because you're going to die. And Hezekiah didn't want to die, so God added to his life, you remember the story, 15 years? And it was in those added 15 years that this wretch Manasseh was born. And because he was 12 years old, it says, and then as you read, he spiritualism, he brought sun worship, he made the people pass through the fire. He did exactly the opposite to what his good father had done. And as you read on down here, it says here in verse 16, moreover, Manasseh shed very much innocent blood. In other words, he was a murderer, and we believe that he killed prophet Isaiah, because tradition says that Isaiah was put into a hollow log. You know, they hung up the rock and they pushed poor old Isaiah into the... Then they got a saw and cut him in half. So, and we know that that's what happened because the book of Hebrews, the 11th chapter, says some of the prophets were sawn asunder, and we believe that that's what happened to Isaiah.
It's barbaric.
Terrible. And then it says that the rest of the acts of Manasseh and all that he did and the sin that he committed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles? So I thought, surely this guy can't do any more. But it says, go over to Chronicles and you can read more. And when you pick up the story that's recorded in Chronicles, you find there that much the same story. It says, so this is verse 9 of 2 Chronicles 33. So Manasseh seduced Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord had destroyed before the children of Israel. So there it is again, emphasising. And verse 10 says, and the Lord spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they would not listen. You know, God gave them, but finally the Lord allowed them to go down to captivity. And while he was in captivity, the Bible says he prayed to God. And I thought, surely God's not going to listen to a guy like that after all that he's done. But you know, the Bible says that God put Manasseh back on the throne, back in Jerusalem. And I've often thought about that. If God would listen to the prayer of a man like that, there's hope for us all.
There is.
And that's why the story's been recorded, to give us hope. And all of us need hope. You know, we all go down into valleys in our experience, and we all need to be given the assurance of hope. And this story has been written in the Bible to give us hope.
Thank you so much, Geoff, for joining us. It's been great chatting with you.
It's been a real pleasure to be with you. God bless you in your work, Kim.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you join us again next time.